The day Raymond Donovan made a promise to a dying man. The sky over Laramie, Wyoming was the color of a bruise, and he had no idea that the words leaving his lips would unravel every careful wall he had ever built around his heart. It was the autumn of 1878, and the territory was still raw in the way that only the West could be raw, full of dust and ambition, and the particular kind of loneliness that settled into a man's bones like a cold that never quite left. Raymond was 26 years old, broad-shouldered from years of ranch work, with dark hair that curled at the collar of his worn flannel shirt, and eyes the color of creek water in late summer, somewhere between green and gray, depending on the light. He was not a man given to sentiment. He had grown up hard, on a homestead that the land eventually swallowed whole, and he had learned early that feelings were expensive things that most men in his position simply could not afford. He had ridden for the Talbot Ranch for 3 years, first as a hired hand, and then, gradually, as something closer to a right-hand man. Franklin Talbot was the kind of rancher who built things slowly and with intention, a man who planted trees he knew he would never live long enough to sit beneath. Raymond respected that. He respected Franklin in the way that young men sometimes respect older men who seem to have figured out something important about living, something that the younger generation is still fumbling toward in the dark. Franklin had a daughter named Inez, and Raymond had been careful not to think too much about her. Not because she was unpleasant to think about, quite the opposite. Inez Talbot was 22 years old that autumn, and she had the kind of beauty that did not announce itself loudly, but rather crept up on a person quietly, like dawn. She had dark brown hair that she wore in a long braid down her back when she was working, and brown eyes that caught the light in a way that made Raymond feel, each time he caught himself looking, like he had just missed a step on a staircase. She laughed easily and often, and she was not afraid of hard work, and she argued with her father at the breakfast table about things like water rights and the treatment of the men who worked the ranch, and she was almost always right, which Raymond suspected Franklin knew perfectly well. Raymond kept his distance. He kept his distance because Inez Talbot was his employer's daughter, and because he was a man who understood his station in life, and because getting tangled up in feelings that could only lead to complications was not something he had any business doing. He was polite. He tipped his hat to her in the mornings and helped her carry things when it was practical, and answered her questions about the horses and the cattle with exactly as many words as were necessary and not a single one more. She saw through all of it. He was fairly certain. She had a way of looking at him that suggested she found his careful reserve mildly amusing, and there were moments when she would say something, some small, sharp, funny thing, and the smile that followed it would hit him like a sudden gust of wind off the high plains, and he would have to find somewhere else to look. He did not let himself think about that. He was very practiced at not thinking about certain things. Then Franklin got sick. It came on fast, the way these things sometimes did in men who had spent decades outdoors in all weathers and never gave their bodies a single day's rest. A cough that Franklin dismissed became a cough that bent him double, and by the time the doctor from Laramie had ridden out to the ranch, it was clear that what Franklin had in his chest was not something that medicine in 1878 had any real answer for. The doctor used the word consumption quietly, standing in the hallway outside Franklin's bedroom, and Raymond watched Inez receive that word with her jaw set and her eyes perfectly dry, the way someone receives news they have been quietly bracing for without admitting it. Franklin declined over 6 weeks. He was the kind of man who declined with dignity, still giving instructions from his bed, still arguing about which pasture the herd should winter on, still asking Raymond for reports on the state of the fences and the water situation at the North Creek. But he was diminishing, and everyone on the ranch could see it, and the days grew shorter and colder in a way that seemed to Raymond like the land itself was marking the occasion. On a Thursday evening in late October, Franklin called Raymond into his room alone. The bedroom smelled of wood smoke, and the liniment the doctor had left, and something else underneath that Raymond could not name, the particular smell of a life that was concluding. Franklin was propped up against his pillows, thinner than he had been even 2 weeks before, but his eyes were still sharp, and his voice, though rougher, still carried the authority of a man who had spent decades being listened to. "Sit down, Raymond," Franklin said. Raymond sat in the ladder-back chair beside the bed and held his hat in his hands and waited. "I want to talk to you about Inez," Franklin said. Raymond kept his face still. "All right. She is going to be alone when I go," Franklin said. "This ranch will be hers, I have made certain of that. The paperwork is with the lawyer in Laramie, there is no question there. But a young woman alone on a working ranch in Wyoming Territory in 1878 is not a simple situation. You know that as well as I do." Raymond nodded. He knew it. The territory was not a gentle place for anyone, but it was particularly ungentle for a woman without a man's protection nearby. There were neighboring ranchers who would see an opportunity. There were drifters and seasonal hands who might take liberties. There were 100 small and large dangers that a woman managing a ranch on her own would have to navigate, and Franklin knew all of them. "I am not asking you to stay on as a hand," Franklin said. "I am asking you something different. I am asking you to look after her. Not to smother her, she won't stand for that, and she shouldn't. She's capable, more capable than most men I've known. But to be there, to be the person who has her back when the situation calls for it." Raymond looked at the man in the bed, at the gray in his beard and the paper-thin skin over his hands, and he felt something move in his chest that he was not entirely equipped to deal with. "I will," he said. "You have my word." Franklin exhaled slowly, and some tension in his shoulders released that Raymond had not noticed was there until it was gone. "There is something else," Franklin said, and his voice dropped a register, became something quieter and more deliberate. "I have watched you for 3 years. I am not a foolish man. I see how you are careful not to look at her, and I see how you look at her when you think no one is watching." Raymond felt the back of his neck go hot. He opened his mouth. "Do not argue with me," Franklin said almost gently. "I am dying and I am right, and neither of those things is negotiable. I am not telling you what to do about it. That is between you and God and whatever courage you can manage to scrape together. I am only telling you that I see it, and that I am not displeased by it. You are a good man, Raymond. You are the kind of man who keeps his word and does his work and does not take what isn't offered to him. My daughter could do a great deal worse." Raymond sat with that for a long moment, turning his hat brim in his hands. "I gave you my word," he said finally. "I will keep her safe." Franklin nodded. "I know you will." Franklin Talbot died 4 days later, on a Monday morning when the first real snow of the season was beginning to come down in soft, unhurried flakes outside the window. Inez sat with him at the end, and Raymond stood in the hallway and listened to the quiet. And when she came out of the room, her face was composed and her eyes were red-rimmed, and she looked at Raymond for a moment in a way that made the promise he had made feel like something physical in his chest, something with weight and edges. "He is gone," she said. "I know," Raymond said. "I am sorry." She nodded once precisely, and then she went to tell the other hands, because that was who Inez Talbot was, someone who grieved without stopping moving. The funeral was simple and well attended. Franklin had been known and respected in the county, and people came from ranches and the town itself to stand at the graveside on the Talbot land, while the preacher spoke and the cold wind moved through the cottonwoods that lined the creek. Raymond stood back a little, at the edge of things, which was where he generally felt most comfortable. He watched Inez stand straight and receive condolences with her hand outstretched and her face composed, and he thought about the promise he had made, and he thought about what her father had said about the way Raymond looked at her when he thought no one was watching, and he decided that the most important thing right now was to be useful and to stay clear-headed and to not complicate anything. He managed the clear-headed and useful parts reasonably well. The staying uncomplicated part was significantly harder than he had anticipated. The weeks after Franklin's death established a new rhythm on the ranch. Inez took the reins of it with a practicality that the other hands, some of whom had not entirely expected a young woman to manage a working cattle operation, found themselves respecting before the first month was out. She knew the land. She knew the cattle. She knew which agreements her father had made with neighboring ranchers, and which ones she intended to renegotiate. And she did all of it with a directness that left very little room for the kind of quiet condescension that Raymond had been half expecting from some of the older men. Raymond's role shifted naturally. He was foreman now, in practice if not always in title, and he and Inez fell into a working relationship that required them to spend a considerable amount of time together each day reviewing the state of the herd, riding the fence lines, making decisions about feed and winter preparations, and the business of the ranch. It was practical and necessary, and Raymond was very good at keeping things practical and necessary. The problem was that Inez was also funny and interesting, and she had opinions about things that Raymond would not have expected, and she expressed those opinions without hedging. And sometimes she would say something in the middle of a completely mundane conversation about cattle prices or fence posts that would catch him so entirely off guard that he would have to disguise his response as clearing his throat or suddenly needing to adjust something on his horse. And then she would smile, that particular smile that was half amusement and half something warmer, and it was as if every carefully arranged piece of his composure simply fell apart like a carved house in a breeze. He fell apart quietly. He was good at that. He had years of practice at containing things, but he was beginning to understand that containing this particular thing was going to require more effort than he had budgeted for. In November, a man named Hector Greer began making what he described as neighborly visits to the Talbot Ranch. Greer owned the largest operation in the county, a man in his mid-40s, heavyset and prosperous-looking, with a way of talking that was all surface courtesy and not much underneath it. He had made it known, in the years before Franklin's death, that he considered the Talbot land an interesting acquisition opportunity. Franklin had rebuffed him with characteristic directness. Now Franklin was gone, and Greer seemed to be of the opinion that circumstances had changed. He came calling on a Tuesday afternoon in November, riding up to the house with two of his men behind him, and Inez received him on the porch with her arms folded, and a look on her face that suggested she was prepared for whatever Greer was about to present. Raymond was repairing tack in the barn nearby, and came to stand in the barn doorway, within earshot but not obtrusive. He told himself this was simply a reasonable precaution. He was keeping his word to Franklin. This was exactly what that looked like. Greer made his offer with the smile of a man who considers the outcome already settled. He wanted to buy the north pasture, the most water-rich section of the Talbot property, the section that controlled access to the creek for the 3 miles that mattered most in a dry year. He named a price that was low enough to be insulting to anyone who knew the land's real value, wrapped it in language about wanting to help a young woman who was surely overwhelmed by the responsibility she had inherited. Inez let him finish. Then she said, very pleasantly and very clearly, that the north pasture was not for sale, that she was not overwhelmed, that she found the framing of his offer somewhat condescending, and that if he had any actual ranch business he wished to discuss she would be happy to hear it, and if he did not, she hoped he had a safe ride home. Raymond, standing in the barn doorway, felt something that was probably too strong a word for pride but was in that neighborhood. Greer left with a smile that had become a good deal less pleasant. His men filed out behind him, and one of them, a lean, pale-eyed young man named Cord, who had a reputation in the county for a quick temper and a quicker draw, looked back at Raymond as he passed in a way that was not exactly a threat but was not entirely not a threat either. Raymond held the look without moving until Cord looked away. That evening, Inez came to find Raymond where he was finishing up in the barn. "You heard all of that," she said. "It was not a question." "I was in earshot," he agreed. "You stayed close," she said. "I was working on the tack," he said. She looked at him for a moment, and there was something in her expression that he could not entirely read. "Thank you," she said finally. "I did not do anything," he said. "You were there," she said. "That was something." She left him standing in the barn with the smell of hay and horses around him, and what she had said sitting somewhere in his chest, warm and inconvenient. December came down hard on the Wyoming Territory, the way it did in years when the storms came in from the north with real conviction. The ranch work shifted to the particular grinding labor of a range winter, keeping water from freezing, getting hay to the cattle, maintaining the structures against the wind. Raymond worked long days alongside the other hands, and came in at night to the bunkhouse, with his hands cracked from the cold and his back aching in a way that was becoming increasingly familiar. On a Thursday in mid-December, a snowstorm came in fast and turned what had been a manageable afternoon into something significantly less manageable. Raymond was out with two of the other hands, a steady older man named Porter and a young Mexican-American hand named Mateo, who had come to the ranch in September and proved himself worth keeping. When the temperature dropped and the wind picked up and the visibility went to nearly nothing inside of 20 minutes. They got the cattle they had been moving into the near pasture and made it back to the barn in deteriorating conditions, and Raymond counted hands twice to make sure everyone was accounted for, and then realized that Inez had ridden out to the east fence line that morning to assess some storm damage that had been reported. He went back out. Porter tried to stop him. "She is a capable woman," Porter said, which was true. "She probably found shelter," Porter said, which was possible. "You cannot see 6 feet in front of you out there," Porter said, which was accurate. "I know," Raymond said, and went out anyway, because the promise he had made Franklin Talbot was not a fair-weather promise, and because something in him that was not entirely rational and not entirely about the promise was not going to let him stand in a warm barn while Inez was somewhere in a blizzard. He found her. It took the better part of an hour, with his horse picking his way carefully through the whiteout, and he found her because he knew the east fence line as well as he knew anything, and because he knew, from a month of watching the way she worked, that when Inez encountered something she could not push through, she looked for higher ground. She had taken shelter in a shallow draw near the east fence, her horse's reins wrapped around her wrist and her hat pulled low against the wind. She was cold and she was annoyed about being cold, and when she saw him riding toward her through the snow she made an expression that was equal parts relief and exasperation. "I was not in danger," she said when he reached her. "I was waiting it out." "I know," he said. "I was in the area." She looked at him in a way that said she knew perfectly well he had ridden back into a blizzard specifically for her, and she was going to allow him the fiction of his explanation, because she was a person who understood dignity. They rode back together, close enough that their horses were nearly shoulder to shoulder, because the visibility made distance inadvisable. The wind was loud and the cold was serious, and Raymond was acutely aware of how close she was, of the shape of her in her heavy coat, of the way she rode without apparent difficulty, even in conditions that would have had a less experienced rider in real trouble. When they got back to the barn and the door was shut against the wind, Inez pulled off her hat and shook the snow from it and looked at him with her cheeks red from the cold and her braid half undone and her eyes bright, and she smiled. It was the kind of smile that was more than a smile. It was warm and genuine and a little bit grateful and a little bit of something else, and Raymond stood there in the lantern-lit barn with snow still on his coat and fell apart so completely and so quietly that he doubted anyone watching could have detected it. He just felt everything inside him settle into a different configuration, one that he understood immediately would not be reversing itself. He said, "You should go warm up at the house. I will see to the horses." She said, "I can see to my own horse." He said, "I know you can, I am offering." She paused and then she said, "Thank you, Raymond," in a tone that was quiet and direct and nothing like the way she usually said his name, and that was somehow worse than the smile. He spent a long time with those horses, giving them far more attention than they required. January brought a thaw, and the thaw brought Hector Greer back. This time, Greer came not with an offer but with a problem, or what he framed as a problem. He claimed that Talbot cattle had broken through a shared fence line and gotten into his pasture, and he wanted compensation. His tone had changed since November. The pleasantness was thinner now, stretched over something harder. Raymond rode out with Inez to look at the fence line in question. They found the damage, significant damage, more than drifting cattle typically caused, the kind of damage that looked like it had been made from the Greer side of the fence rather than the Talbot side. Raymond crouched beside the broken posts and examined the evidence with the careful attention of a man who had spent years working land and knew what careless cattle looked like versus what something else looked like. He looked up at Inez, who was looking at the same evidence and had arrived at the same conclusion. "He broke this himself," she said quietly. "That is what it looks like," Raymond agreed. "He wants a pretext," she said, "for legal action or for pressure." "Yes," Raymond said. They rode back with the problem between them and the flat winter light on the snow, and Inez's jaw set in that particular way it got when she was working through something difficult and not planning to be defeated by it. "We document everything," she said. "Every visit, every claim, every damaged fence. We write it down with dates and keep it." "That is smart," Raymond said. "I am going to need a lawyer," she said. "The one in Laramie, my father's lawyer, he is straightforward, but I may need someone with more experience in property disputes." "There is a man in Cheyenne," Raymond said. "His name is Aldridge. He has handled cases against larger landholders before. He has a reputation for being difficult to push around." Inez looked at him. "How do you know about him?" "I read," Raymond said, "and I pay attention to things that might matter." She looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for a practical conversation about lawyers, and something moved across her face that he could not quite name, and then she said, "All right, I will write to Aldridge." The letter went out that week. The documentation project began. Inez kept a small journal in which she recorded every incident, every fence, every visit, every insinuation in her careful, precise handwriting. Raymond contributed his own observations, which she incorporated, and the act of this collaboration, of sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings while the stove put out heat, and the wind moved outside, and Inez wrote in her journal, and occasionally asked him to confirm a detail or a date, was something Raymond found himself looking forward to with an intensity that he recognized as not being entirely about ranch management. The kitchen table evenings became a habit. There was always some legitimate reason for them: the journal, or reviewing the monthly accounts, or planning the spring work. And they were entirely proper, because Inez's housekeeper, a widowed woman named Mrs. Lofton, was always somewhere in the house. But there was something about the intimacy of a warm kitchen on a cold night, and the lamp between them and Inez's voice, talking through the day's events with the same directness she gave everything, that made Raymond feel more at home than he had felt anywhere in a very long time. She made him coffee one evening in late January, and when she set the cup in front of him, she said, without particular emphasis, "You could have left after my father died, you know. A lot of men would have. The situation is not simple." Raymond looked at the cup. "I know. Why did you stay?" she asked. She was not asking it as a challenge. She was asking it the way she asked most things, with a genuine desire to understand. "He thought about saying because your father asked me to. He thought about saying because it is a good position, and the work suits me. He thought about several practical and sufficient answers that would have been, if not entirely the whole truth, at least defensible portions of it. What he said was, because this is where I want to be." He had not planned to say it quite like that. He watched something shift in her expression, something that opened and then was quickly, carefully managed. "I am glad," she said, and she picked up her pen and went back to the journal, and Raymond drank his coffee and kept his face composed and thought about the promise he had made and how much larger and more complicated it had become since the moment he made it. February arrived with a particular incident that could not be managed quietly. One of Greer's men, the Palide cord, was found late on a Friday afternoon on the Talbot property near the South Barn, where there was no legitimate reason for him to be. Raymond found him, and the exchange that followed was brief and tense, and resulted in Cord leaving without incident, but with a message that was not subtle. Greer was not finished. Raymond reported this to Inez immediately. He also, that same evening, rode to the nearest neighbor, a decent and fair-minded rancher named Elias Hartfield, who had known Franklin and had made clear his dislike of Greer's methods, and informed him of the situation. Hartfield was concerned. He offered to provide testimony if anything came to legal proceedings. He also mentioned, carefully, that word in the county was that Greer had been making inquiries about the Talbot water rights with people who had connections to the territorial legislature. This was more serious than a broken fence. Water rights in Wyoming Territory in 1878 were not a small matter. The legal framework around them was still being established, and a man with Greer's money and connections could potentially do real damage through channels that had nothing to do with broken fence posts. When Raymond told Inez what Hartfield had said, she sat very still for a moment. "We need Aldrich here," she said. "Not a letter, in person." "I will ride to Cheyenne," Raymond said. She looked at him. "That is 4 days hard riding in February." "I know," he said. "You do not have to." "Inez," he said, and the use of her given name without any of the usual formality made her stop. He rarely used it. He had been careful about that. "I will ride to Cheyenne. It is not a hardship." She looked at him for a moment, and the thing that happened in her expression was something different from the careful management he had been watching all winter. It was something that he thought, with a careful and cautious and perhaps slightly hopeful part of his mind, might be the same thing he was trying to keep from showing on his own face. "All right," she said softly. "Thank you." He left for Cheyenne the next morning before the sun was fully up, with provisions and a letter of introduction from Inez and the particular feeling of a man doing something that matters. Cheyenne in February was cold and busy and considerably larger than Laramie, a town that had grown fast with the railroad and had the particular character of places where money and ambition had arrived in a rush. Raymond found Aldrich's office on the second day, in a building on a commercial street where several law offices sat in close proximity. Aldrich turned out to be a compact man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a manner that wasted very little time on social niceties, which Raymond found refreshing. Raymond laid out the situation clearly. Aldrich listened without interrupting, asked 3 or 4 pointed questions, and then leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "The water rights issue is where the real danger is," Aldrich said. "The fence incidents are harassment and nuisance, but they are nothing that documentation cannot address. Water rights in the current legislative climate in this territory are a different matter. Your employer's position is defensible. The Talbot family's claim to that creek access is clearly established and predates Greer's operation, but it needs to be established in formal record now, before Greer's connections have time to create a competing claim." "What needs to happen?" Raymond asked. Aldrich told him. It involved filings in the county seat and in Cheyenne, and it involved Inez's physical presence for some of them, and it would cost money but not an unreasonable amount, and it needed to happen in the next 60 days. Raymond rode back to the Talbot ranch in 3.5 days, pushing a little harder than he had on the way out. He arrived in the early evening on a day that had warmed enough to feel almost like a promise of spring, and when he rode into the yard, Inez came out of the house and stood on the porch and looked at him with an expression that, in the particular failing light of the February late afternoon, did something to his chest that he had simply given up trying to manage. He told her everything Aldrich had said. They sat at the kitchen table with the journal between them, and she took notes in her precise handwriting and asked questions that were good questions, and by the end of the evening they had the outline of a plan. "I can ride to Laramie day after tomorrow," she said. "Start the county filings." "I will ride with you," he said. "It is not necessary for both of us. I will ride with you," he said again, and something in his tone, quiet and completely certain, made her stop arguing. She looked at him across the table, in the lamplight, with the coffee cooling between them and the sound of the wind outside, and Mrs. Lofton's quiet movements somewhere in the back of the house. "Raymond," she said, "why are you so determined to look after me?" He held her gaze. "I told your father I would." "My father has been gone for 3 months," she said. "A promise made to a dying man, that is not a lifelong obligation. You have done more than could be expected." "It is not only the promise," he said, and then stopped. She waited. Inez Talbot was good at waiting. She did not fill silence with noise. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked back at her. "I am not very practiced at saying this kind of thing," he said. "I am better at doing things." "I know," she said. And there was something in the way she said it, warm and a little amused, and something else that made it easier somehow. "I would like to keep looking after you," he said. "Not because of the promise, or not only because of the promise, because—" he stopped, started again. "Because the days I spend here, working this place with you, talking over things at this table, they are the best days I have had in as long as I can remember. And I am aware that I am your foreman and that this is not a simple thing to say, and I am not saying it to make anything difficult. I am saying it because I think you should know it." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods. Inez looked at him for a long moment, and the expression on her face was not one he had seen before, something that was tender and honest, and a little bit careful, the way she got when something mattered. "I have known for a while," she said quietly. "I have known, and I have also been trying very hard not to know, because I was not certain what to do with it. This is my father's ranch, my ranch now, and there are people who would say things, and I am not sure I care very much about what those people would say, but I have been cautious." "You do not have to," he began. "Let me finish," she said, not unkindly. "I have been cautious because I am not a woman who does things carelessly. I do not make decisions without understanding them, but I also—" She paused, and what happened in her face then was something that made everything in Raymond's chest simply stop for a moment. "I also find myself, when you ride out in the morning, counting the hours until you ride back, and I do not think that is about the ranch reports." The silence that followed was the kind that has substance, that sits between two people with warmth rather than distance. Raymond said, very quietly, "I have been falling apart every time you smile since approximately October." Inez laughed, a real laugh, startled and genuine, and that was a smile too, and he did what he always did with her smiles, which was feel something give way in him with a sensation that was completely indistinguishable from happiness. "That is a very specific timeline," she said. "I am a specific person," he said. She reached across the table and set her hand over his, and it was the simplest gesture in the world, and it was everything. They rode to Laramie together 2 days later to begin the legal filings, and the ride itself was different from all the rides they had taken together before, not in anything visible or dramatic, but in the particular quality of the space between them, which had been carefully maintained and was now something else. They talked easily and continuously, the way people do when a constraint has been removed, and Raymond learned things about Inez that the careful professionalism of the previous months had not given him room for, that she had wanted to study medicine when she was 16 and had found no path to do it, that she had opinions about the railroad that were considerably more complicated than most people's, that her mother had died when Inez was 9, and she still sometimes woke from dreams in which her mother was still alive, and the morning was difficult. He told her things in return. About the homestead that had failed, about his younger brother who had gone east for work and written letters for a while and then stopped, about the particular loneliness of ranch work in winter, which he had always managed but which had felt different this winter, lighter somehow, because of the kitchen table evenings. Laramie received them without ceremony. The county clerk's office was on the main street, a drafty building with a clerk who examined Inez's documentation and Aldridge's written instructions, with the careful attention of a man who understood that water rights were serious, and who, to his credit, seemed genuinely interested in doing his job correctly. The filings took most of the day. By the time they were done, the sun was going, and staying the night in Laramie was the practical decision. Raymond arranged rooms at the hotel, separate rooms, managed properly, because this was 1878, and because Inez was not the kind of woman to be handled carelessly, and he was not the kind of man to try. And they had supper in the hotel dining room, sitting across from each other at a small table with a candle between them. And it was the first time Raymond had seen Inez in a setting that was not the ranch or the trail, and the soft light was kind to her, in a way that the daylight was not unkind. She told him over supper about a conversation she had with her father about a month before he died. Franklin had told her, she said, that the most important thing about the ranch was not the land or the cattle but the people who worked it with care and intention, and that she should hold on to those people if she found them. He was talking about more than ranch hands, she said. I know, Raymond said. He told me he had asked you to look after me, she said. He told me the day before he asked you. He said he was going to, and he said, she paused. He said he thought you were a man worth knowing. Raymond was quiet for a moment. He was a man worth knowing, he said finally. Yes, she said. He was. They raised their coffee cups to Franklin Talbot in the candle-lit dining room of the Laramie Hotel, and outside the windows the town went about its evening business, and Raymond felt the shape of the man's absence and his blessing at the same time, layered over each other the way things sometimes are. On the ride back to the ranch the next morning, with a cold, bright sun on the snow and the territory laid out in all directions around them, Inez pulled her horse alongside Raymond's close enough that their knees almost touched. I want to ask you something, she said. All right, he said. What do you want? Not what you have promised, not what you owe me or this ranch. What do you actually want? He considered this seriously, the way she deserved. He looked at the road ahead and at the mountains in the distance and at the shape of the country he had come to know over 3 years of riding it. This land, he said. Work that means something. A table to come back to in the evening. He glanced at her. You. She held his gaze for a moment, and the smile that followed, slow and certain and warmer than the February sun, dismantled him so completely that he was surprised he stayed upright in the saddle. That seems like an achievable set of goals, she said. The spring came to Wyoming Territory the way it always did, reluctantly and then all at once. The snow retreated from the lower pastures, the creek ran high with melt, and the ranch shifted into the particular high-activity season of calving and branding, and everything else that could not wait. Raymond worked alongside the hands and alongside Inez, and there was now a naturalness to it, a comfort in their working partnership that the other hands noticed and did not seem to object to. Porter, who had been with the ranch for years and had watched everything, said nothing about it but smiled to himself in a way that suggested he had been expecting it. Mateo, who was 20 years old and considerably more direct than Porter, told Raymond one morning while they were working on the calf pens that if Raymond was not going to do something about the way things were between him and the ranch owner, Mateo was going to find it personally frustrating to watch. Raymond gave Mateo an appropriately dignified look and said nothing, but Mateo was not wrong. The trouble with Greer came to a head in April. Aldridge arrived from Cheyenne in person at the end of March, and spent 2 days at the Talbot Ranch reviewing everything and making a formal assessment of the legal position. His conclusion was that the water rights filing had been timely and was solid, and that Greer's legal position was significantly weaker than Greer probably wanted to acknowledge. But Aldridge also said that Greer was unlikely to simply accept this, and that a man in Greer's position, with his resources and his temperament, was likely to find other pressure points. The other pressure point turned out to be one of the spring hands, a new hire named Blevins who had come on for the calving season, and who, it emerged in the first week of April, was reporting to Cord. He was not doing anything so dramatic as sabotage. He was simply paying attention and talking to the wrong people. Raymond discovered this through a combination of observation and the kind of instinct that develops in men who pay close attention to the people around them. He said nothing to Blevins directly. He raised it with Inez. Inez thought about it for a day, and then she had a direct conversation with Blevins, not an accusation, because she could not prove anything, but a conversation that made it clear she was aware of the situation. Blevins left the next morning. The other hands noted his departure without asking questions, because ranch hands in the Wyoming Territory in 1878 understood that these things happened, and they had their own loyalties. Greer made one more approach in mid-April, and it was the last one. He came himself, with Cord and 2 other men, and this time his pleasantness was entirely gone. He made no pretense of an offer. He made what could be described, with only a small degree of diplomatic interpretation, as a threat regarding what might happen to a ranch that found itself without reliable water access or reliable hands if certain arrangements were not made. Inez listened to all of it on her porch without the expression on her face shifting by a single degree. Raymond stood at the foot of the porch steps, not threatening, not aggressive, just present and entirely still in the way of a man who is not going to move. When Greer finished, Inez said that she had found his visit informative, that she would be writing a full account of it with dates and exact language to Aldridge and to the county sheriff and to the territorial governor's land office, and that she hoped he rode safely. Greer looked at Raymond. Then he looked back at Inez. Something in his calculation shifted. He left. He did not come back. The threat he had made was documented and sent. Aldridge responded by filing an additional complaint with the territorial authorities. The county sheriff, a decent man named Pryor who had known Franklin, paid a visit to Greer's ranch that Raymond later heard had been both polite and pointed. And 3 weeks after Greer's last visit, Elias Hartfield came to tell them that word in the county was that Greer had decided to focus his attentions on a different acquisition opportunity in a different county, and that the situation was likely resolved. The day Hartfield rode away with that news, Inez stood in the yard for a moment in the spring sunshine, with the sound of the creek running full and the cattle in the far pasture and the whole operational hum of a working ranch in a good season around her. And she tilted her face up to the sky briefly in a gesture that was private and meant for no one. Raymond was 20 feet away, and he saw it, and he let himself see it without looking anywhere else. She came to find him afterward where he was working at the water trough. She leaned against the fence beside him. "It is over," she said. "It seems so," he said. "My father would have found the entire thing exhausting," she said, "and he would have managed it beautifully." "Yes," Raymond said, "so did you." She looked at him sideways, the particular slanted look she gave him when she was deciding something. "I did not do it alone," she said. "You did most of it," he said. "You rode to Cheyenne in February," she said, "in a blizzard winter." "It was not actually blizzarding when I left," he said. She laughed. The spring light was generous, and the creek was loud, and her laugh in that setting was the kind of thing that Raymond thought he would probably remember for as long as he could remember anything. He did not even pretend to look somewhere else this time. "I want to ask you something again," she said. "The same question I asked on the road from Laramie." "You know what I said," he said. "I know," she said. "I want to know if you still mean it." He turned to face her properly, away from the water trough, with the spring afternoon behind her and the serious honesty in his face that was the most truthful thing he had. "More than I did then," he said. "The wedding was in June. It was held on the Talbot property, outside, because neither of them were particularly interested in a church ceremony, and because the ranch in June was as beautiful as anywhere Raymond had ever seen. The cottonwoods were fully leafed and the creek was still running high, and Elias Hartfield and his wife came, and the hands were all present, and Mrs. Lofton cried throughout the whole thing, with an expression that suggested she found her own crying inconvenient, but was unable to stop it. Aldridge came up from Cheyenne and stood at the back and looked pleased with himself, which Raymond thought was slightly presumptuous but not entirely undeserved. The preacher was a traveling minister who turned out to have a sense of humor and a genuinely kind face, and the ceremony was short and direct, in the way that both Inez and Raymond preferred things. When it was done and the preacher said they were married, Inez looked at Raymond with an expression that was everything warm and certain, and a little bit amused in the way she always was when she caught him being exactly himself. And she smiled, and Raymond, standing in front of all these people on a June afternoon with the love of his life looking at him like that, did what he always did when she smiled. He felt everything inside him give way completely, and this time he did not even try to contain it. He kissed her. She kissed him back with a warmth and a certainty that matched his own, and the people around them made the kind of noise that people make at weddings when they can tell that a thing is real. The party that followed lasted through the afternoon and into the evening, with food that Mrs. Lofton and Hartfield's wife had prepared, and whiskey that Porter had contributed, and a fiddle player from town who knew enough songs to keep people moving. Raymond danced with Inez twice, which was 2 more times than he had ever danced with anyone in his life. He was not a natural dancer. She thought this was wonderful. "You are very serious about your footwork," she told him during the second dance. "I am concentrating," he said. "I know," she said. "It is one of my favorite things about you." He missed a step. She caught him. They both laughed, and that moment, her hands correcting his, her face open and delighted, the fiddle music carrying over the sound of the creek and the June evening, was one of those moments that he would carry in some specific and exact form for the rest of his life. The years that followed were good years. They were not without difficulty. The territory was the territory, and ranch work was ranch work, and 1879 brought a drought that made everyone's summer hard, and 1880 brought a dispute with a surveyor over a boundary line that required Aldridge's involvement again and cost more than it should have. But they were good years, the way that years can be good when they contain the right things in the right proportions. The ranch grew. Not dramatically. Inez was not interested in growth for its own sake, a sensibility she had inherited from Franklin, but purposefully. She expanded the herd by a number she had calculated was sustainable, made 2 improvements to the barn that paid for themselves within a season, and negotiated a selling agreement with a buyer in Cheyenne that gave the operation a stability it had previously lacked. Raymond was beside her for all of it, and the working partnership that had begun in the careful formality of an employer-foreman relationship had become something so thoroughly intermixed that neither of them could have said where one ended and the other began, which was, they both agreed, a significant improvement over the previous arrangement. Mateo stayed on and became Raymond's equivalent in the running of the hands, competent and increasingly confident, with an honest and direct manner that the other men respected. He eventually married a woman from Laramie named Clara, who worked as a seamstress and had opinions about everything, which Raymond thought was a natural fit. In the autumn of 1880, Inez told Raymond one evening at the kitchen table, the same table where so much had happened, where the journal had been kept and the coffee had gone cold, and the promise had become something larger than itself, that they were expecting a child. Raymond sat very still for a moment. Then he reached across and took her hand, the same gesture she had made to him at this same table nearly 2 years before, and he held it. "Are you frightened?" she asked. "Yes," he said, and also he shook his head. He was still not naturally a man of elaborate expression. "Yes," he said again, and she knew what he meant by it. She squeezed his hand. "Good," she said. "I am too. We can be frightened together." The boy was born in May of 1881. He arrived after a long and difficult labor that required the Laramie doctor to ride out in the middle of the night, and during which Raymond sat in the kitchen and was unable to do anything useful for the first time in recent memory, which was its own particular kind of difficulty. Mrs. Lofton managed him with firm and practiced kindness, providing coffee at intervals and honest updates when there were honest updates to give. When the doctor came out and told him that his wife and son were doing well, Raymond sat in the kitchen chair for a moment with his hands between his knees and said nothing, because there was nothing adequate to say. He was allowed in after a suitable interval, and Inez was exhausted and bright-eyed, and had the baby wrapped in a blanket in the crook of her arm. And she looked at Raymond when he came through the door in a way that was the fullest version of every smile she had ever given him. He sat beside her on the bed and she put the baby in his arms, and Raymond held his son for the first time and felt with complete certainty that he had no idea what he was doing and was also exactly where he was supposed to be. "What do we call him?" Inez asked. Raymond looked at the baby's face, small and red and entirely uninterested in forming opinions yet about anything. "Franklin," he said, "if you want to." Inez looked at him for a moment with something in her expression that made the room seem very quiet. "Yes," she said. "Franklin." Franklin Donovan grew into a child of astonishing opinions, which no one familiar with either of his parents found particularly surprising. He walked early and talked earlier, and by the time he was 2, he had established clear views about horses and meals, and the ordering of the ranch day that he expressed with impressive conviction for a person of his size. Raymond taught him to ride on a gentle old mare in the summer of 1883, walking alongside him in the late afternoon light with his hand near the saddle but not gripping it, giving Franklin the experience of managing the horse himself before the management was entirely safe, in the way that his own father had taught him before the homestead failed and everything changed. Inez stood at the fence and watched, and when Franklin executed a creditable small loop of the near pasture on his own and pulled the horse to a stop with visible pride, she applauded and called out to him, and her voice carrying across the summer afternoon was the best sound Raymond could think of. In 1884, the ranch welcomed a second child, a daughter they named Alina after Inez's mother, with her mother's dark hair, and it quickly became apparent her father's persistent and slightly maddening self-containment. Alina would sit and observe situations with large, serious eyes for long periods before deciding how she felt about them, which Raymond found both recognizable and deeply amusing. Franklin adored his sister with the fervor of a small person who has been the only small person in the house and has been uncertain about the change until the moment he met her, at which point he became immediately certain. By the time Alina was walking, Franklin was explaining things to her with the enthusiastic inaccuracy of an older sibling, and Alina was receiving these explanations with the skeptical attention of someone who planned to verify them independently as soon as she was able. The spring of 1885 brought Mateo's first child, a son he and Clara named Thomas, and the ranch had by that point become, in the way that good places sometimes do, something more than a working operation. It was a small community, with a handful of families connected to it, and a rhythm that accommodated children and celebrations, and the ordinary accumulated weight of lives lived alongside each other. On a Tuesday evening in May of 1885, when the children were asleep and Mrs. Lofton had retired for the night, and the kitchen was quiet and warm with the last of the day's heat, Raymond and Inez sat at the table in the lamplight. There was no journal on the table. The Greer business was long concluded and documented and closed. Just 2 cups of coffee, and the comfortable quiet of people who have been in each other's company long enough that silence is as good as conversation. Inez was reading a letter from Aldridge, who had become something like a friend over the years, who wrote occasionally with news from Cheyenne and commentary on the state of territorial politics, which he found continuously irritating. Raymond was looking at the window, at the dark beyond it, at the Wyoming night that had become over the years as familiar as anything he had ever known. "What are you thinking about?" Inez asked, without looking up from the letter. "Your father," he said. She did look up then. She set the letter down. "I think about him on evenings like this," Raymond said. "He would have liked tonight, the way the ranch is, the children." He would have been utterly insufferable about Franklin, Inez said. In the best possible way. He would have told anyone who would listen that the boy was remarkable. He would not have been wrong, Raymond said. Inez smiled, and it was the evening version of her smile, quieter than the full daylight version, softer, without the particular brightness that the outdoors gave it, but somehow more intimate for all that. The kind of smile that belonged to a private room and a lamp and years of accumulated knowing. Raymond felt the familiar sensation, the giving way, the warmth that spread through him like the first heat of a fire catching, and he did not disguise it or look elsewhere or apply any of the careful management that he had once used. He simply felt it and let it be on his face, and she saw it the way she always did. "You are still doing that," she said. "I expect I always will," he said. She reached across the table. He put his hand over hers. "He would have been happy," she said, "to see this." "I know," Raymond said. "I'm happy too." He said it simply, without ceremony, the way a man says a thing he has known for a long time and does not need to elaborate on. It was true in the way that the land outside was true, solid and established and not going anywhere. Inez turned her hand over under his so that their fingers interlaced. Outside, the May night was full of the sounds that Wyoming made in the right season, the creek, the wind in the cottonwoods, the very distant and pleasant sound of nothing alarming whatsoever. "My father chose well," she said softly, "when he asked you." Raymond thought about the room in October 3 years before, the lamp and the quilts and the smell of liniment, and the sound of Franklin Talbot's voice telling him to sit down, the weight of the promise settling into him as he made it. "I think," he said carefully, "that he saw something I was not yet willing to admit." "What did he see?" she asked, though he thought she knew. "That I would have stayed anyway," Raymond said. "Promise or no promise, I would have found a reason." She looked at him with that expression, the one he had no complete name for, the one that was warmth and intelligence and certainty all at once, the one that had undone him repeatedly and consistently for years and showed no sign of stopping. "Yes," she said. "I rather think you would have." The summer of 1885 was the best summer Raymond could remember, which was a thing he said privately to himself each summer and had been saying for several years, because each summer was in some way the best of them, having been built on all the previous ones. Franklin was 4 years old and relentless and delightful. Eleanor was 1 year old and beginning to form opinions about the horse situation, which she communicated through a series of gestures and sounds that had their own internal logic. The ranch was in its best condition it had been in since before Franklin Talbot's illness, with the fences sound and the herd healthy, and the water rights firmly and legally established, in a way that no one was going to be able to contest without a great deal of futile effort. Porter retired that autumn, 63 years old, with enough in his wages saved to take a modest house in Laramie, which he did, and from which he wrote occasional letters about the state of town life that suggested he found it less interesting than he had anticipated. Raymond visited him twice in the following years, and they sat on Porter's small porch and talked about the ranch and the territory and the way things had gone. And Porter always said at some point in the conversation that he had known about Inez and Raymond before either of them had fully admitted it to themselves, which Raymond acknowledged without argument. By 1887, Wyoming Territory was moving toward statehood, a process that took another 3 years to complete, but that was already reshaping the legal and political landscape of the region. Inez followed this with close attention, understanding that statehood would have implications for land law and water rights, and everything else that touched the ranch. She wrote letters to Aldridge and to a woman in Cheyenne who was among the first women in the territory to be publicly engaged in questions of civic governance, a correspondence that Raymond was proud of and that produced, over years, a genuine and substantive friendship. The question of women's rights in Wyoming was not a simple one, but it was one the territory had engaged with earlier than most women had been able to vote in Wyoming Territory since 1869. Which was a fact that Inez considered both encouraging and an indication of how much distance remained between a legal right and the full texture of a life lived equally. Raymond listened to her think through these questions with the same attention he gave everything she said, which was complete. He was also, by this point, a man who had been softened in the best possible sense by years of living alongside someone who thought carefully about justice and expressed those thoughts without self-censorship. He was not the same man who had ridden for the Talbot Ranch in 1875, or rather, he was that man, but opened up in some way, enlarged by love and by the particular education of watching Inez Talbot navigate the world on her own terms. In the spring of 1888, Inez found out she was expecting again. The news arrived with the mix of joy and practical concern that characterized both of them in most things, and was received with the same steadiness they had brought to all the major moments of their marriage. The pregnancy was smooth, and the birth, in November, when the first snow was on the ground, was faster and easier than the previous two. Another son, with Raymond's dark hair and Inez's particular stubborn eyes. They named him Clarence after no one specific, simply because they both liked the sound of it, and because Franklin had named the last three of his toy horses with names beginning in C, and it seemed fitting. Franklin, 7 years old and authoritative about these things, approved of his new brother with the critical generosity of a child who considers himself an expert on brothers due to his experience with Alina. Alina, 3 years old, was cautiously interested, and spent the first week of Clarence's life examining him from a safe distance, before deciding that he was acceptable. The house was full in a way that Raymond had not known houses could be full, growing up in the stripped-down practicality of a failing homestead. It was full of sound and argument and small crises and laughter, and the particular chaos of 3 children at 3 different stages of development, all of whom had opinions. Raymond moved through it each day with the feeling of a man who has found the place where he belongs and knows it, not complacently, but with a kind of daily gratitude that he was not naturally expressive about, but that Inez could read in him the way she read most things, accurately and without requiring him to perform it. Wyoming became a state in July of 1890, the 44th state of the Union. They celebrated in Laramie, which put on a considerable show. There was music and speeches, and a general atmosphere of civic pride that Raymond found he shared, somewhat to his own surprise. He was not generally a man of civic enthusiasm, but this was the place where his life was, where his children were being raised. And standing on the main street of Laramie with Inez beside him and Franklin holding Alina's hand and Clarence riding on Raymond's shoulders, because he was 2 years old, and had no intention of walking anywhere he could avoid walking. He felt the statehood in the way you feel things that are part of your life, rather than things that are happening to someone else. Franklin Talbot, the man they had named their son for, had planted trees he would never sit beneath. Raymond stood in the shade of something similar and thought about that. In the years after statehood, the ranch continued to evolve. Franklin, growing into himself with the same combination of his mother's directness and his father's quiet steadiness, developed a serious interest in horses specifically rather than cattle generally. And by the time he was 12, he was working with the animals in a way that suggested a genuine gift. Inez, observing this, began investigating whether the operation might be expanded to include a breeding program, a question she and Raymond discussed at the kitchen table over a number of evenings, with the same seriousness they had once brought to water rights. Alina, whose cautious observation of the world had not diminished with age but had simply become more sophisticated, had decided by her 11th year that she was going to learn everything possible about botany and land management, having identified that the question of what grew where and why was fundamental to everything else about ranch life. She corresponded with a professor at the University of Wyoming with the bold directness of a child who has been raised by Inez Talbot and has therefore never absorbed the idea that asking questions is presumptuous. Clarence, the youngest, was sunny and noisy and profoundly social, in a way that suggested some genetic combination had produced something different from either parent, and which both Raymond and Inez found baffling and wonderful. On a September evening in 1893, when the aspen had turned, and the ranch was in the particular golden state that it reached in the best weeks of early fall, Inez and Raymond sat on the porch of the house after supper. The children were inside. There was some kind of argument in progress between Franklin and Inez that had been going on in a low-level way for most of the evening, and was probably not going to resolve itself before bedtime. Clarence had fallen asleep in his chair at the supper table and had been carried in by Raymond with the boneless compliance of a deeply unconscious 5-year-old, and was presumably still sleeping. The aspen made their particular September sound, a rattling, silver-edged sound that Raymond had come to associate with this time of year the way he associated the creek noise in spring and the silence of January snow. Inez had a cup of tea. He had coffee. The porch boards were worn smooth in the places where they were used most, and the rocking chairs, a luxury that Mrs. Lofton had strongly advocated for several years ago, and that Raymond had quietly agreed with, creaked in the particular rhythm of porch chairs in the early evening. Porter wrote, Inez said. She had opened the letter at supper and was now summarizing it in the way she did. "How is he?" Raymond asked. "Opinionated," she said. "Which is his normal condition. He says Laramie is growing too fast and he does not care for it. He also says he saw Aldridge at the land office last month and that Aldridge looks well but is getting old." "We are all getting old," Raymond said. "Speak for yourself," she said, and there was the smile, at the age of 37 exactly the same as it had been at 22, and still doing exactly what it had always done to him. He was 37 himself, and the years had been specific about this. He had gray at his temples now, and his back was more reliable about telling him when the weather was changing than it had been at 25, and the hard winter work left him sore in ways that recovered more slowly than they once had. None of this troubled him. The years had been good years, and they showed on him the way good years should show, not as damage but as depth. "I want to tell you something," he said. She looked at him, curious. "I have been trying to think of how to say it for a while," he said. "I am not going to find a better moment, so I am going to say it now." "All right," she said. He looked out at the aspens for a moment, finding his words in the way he always did, slowly and deliberately. "The morning your father called me into that room," he said, "I thought I understood what the world was and what my place in it was. I thought I understood who I was. I had made myself fairly small, I think, without knowing it. I had made a life that fit in the corners of things and did not ask for too much." She was listening with the complete attention she gave to things that mattered. "What happened after that," he said, "was not what I planned. The promise I made him, I meant it. I meant every word of it, but it turned into something I had not anticipated. It turned into everything." He paused. "You turned into everything." The aspen moved. From inside the house, the argument between Franklin and Inez had subsided into occasional muffled statements, which probably meant one of them had gotten tired. Inez set her tea down and turned in her chair to face him. The September light was failing into the soft, particular gold of early evening, and it was kind to her in the way that light was always kind to the things it loved. "I know," she said softly. "I know that is true. And I want you to know," she paused in the way she rarely did, which meant she was being careful with something. "I used to wonder in the very beginning whether you were staying because of the promise, whether the feeling was real or whether it was obligation that had been mistaken for something else." "And now?" he asked. "Now I have watched you for 15 years, she said. "I have watched you ride back through storms I did not send you into. I have watched you hold our children the way you hold the most careful things. I have watched you at this ranch every season and every kind of day, and I know exactly what is real and what it is not." She reached over and put her hand against his face, the way she did sometimes when words were insufficient and she had to let her hands do it. "It is real," she said, "all of it." He put his hand over hers, pressing it against his jaw, and closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, she was still looking at him with that expression, the one that had no simple name, the one that was everything she was all at once. "I love you," he said. "I have been saying it for years in every way except that one." "I know," she said, "and I love you. I have been saying it back." He kissed her in the September evening on the porch of the house that had been Franklin Talbot's house and was now theirs, and the aspens made their silver sound, and the light went down slowly the way it did in Wyoming in the best part of fall, and from inside the house Clarence woke up and made the particular sound of a 5-year-old who has woken in an unfamiliar chair and wants to know where everyone is. Inez pulled back and laughed. Raymond put his forehead against hers for a moment. Then he stood and went inside to collect his youngest son, and the evening continued in the manner of evenings that have children in them, which is to say loud and warm and full. The following years drew themselves out in the particular way of years that contain more good than anything else, not without difficulty, because the land demanded difficulty as a matter of course, and a ranch was always a negotiation with weather and market and the thousand small emergencies of a working operation, but with a foundation so established and a partnership so complete that the difficulties landed differently. Franklin grew into a young man who was, at 16, already handling the horse breeding program with a confidence that drew notice from ranchers around the county. He had his mother's precision about things and his father's patience with animals, and these two qualities together made him genuinely gifted at working with horses that other people found difficult. Eleanor, at 14, was writing letters to institutions in Cheyenne and Denver about botanical education opportunities with the calm determination of someone who has never really doubted that what she wants exists. She has only to find it. Raymond thought, watching her, that she was her mother's daughter in every essential way. Clarence was 8 and beloved by everyone on the ranch and in the neighboring properties, being the kind of child who made friends with the ease of breathing and who would, Raymond thought, probably always be well surrounded. In 1896, Mateo's son Thomas turned 15 and started working the ranch in a serious capacity, which meant that the Talbot Donovan operation had, in a genuine sense, a second generation engaged in it. Mateo, 41 now and a fixture, had the satisfied look of a man who has built something he can see. On the last day of October of 1896, a date that meant something to Raymond for reasons that he kept to himself, it being the general anniversary of the conversation with Franklin Talbot that had started everything, Raymond rode out to the north pasture alone in the early morning. The grass was dry and winter yellow, and the sky was the particular flat blue of late October in Wyoming, and the creek was low but still running, still on the land, still where it had always been because they had made certain of it. He sat on his horse in the middle of the north pasture and looked at the mountains and thought about the sequence of events, the promise, the storm, the kitchen table, the lawyer, the wedding, the children, with the particular sensation of a man who can see the shape of his life clearly and is not sorry about what he sees. He had promised a dying man he would keep his daughter safe. He had not expected that the keeping would look like this, not like guarding, not like protecting from the outside, but like building something together from the inside out, brick by brick, season by season, until the thing they had built was large enough that safety was simply one of its qualities and not its whole purpose. He had not expected to fall apart every time she smiled, and to find that falling apart was, in the end, not destruction but the opposite, the dismantling of the smaller, more contracted version of himself to make room for something larger and more true. He rode back to the ranch as the sun was coming up properly, the cold morning air moving around him and the horse's breath making small clouds. The smoke was coming from the kitchen chimney, the sound of the ranch waking up the horses, the movement in the barn. Somewhere in the house a door was the sound of everything he had. It was a considerable sound. Inez was in the kitchen when he came in at the stove with her hair still in its night braid and an apron over her dress, and she looked up when he came through the door with the look she gave him in the mornings, warm and immediate and entirely natural, the look of a person who is genuinely glad to see the person who has just walked in. It was not a grand gesture. It was a daily one. It had been a daily one for 15 years. She smiled at him. He felt it the way he always felt it. The warmth, the giving way, the particular interior reorganization that had been happening since October of 1878 and showed no sign of stopping. He took his hat off and hung it on the hook by the door and crossed the kitchen and kissed her good morning in the way that married people do, easy and real, with the coffee smell in the air and the stove putting out heat and somewhere upstairs the sound of children beginning to be awake. "You were out early," she said. "I went to the north pasture," he said. She looked at him. She knew what the north pasture meant to him on this date. "And," she said. He looked at her, at the gray that was beginning at her temples that matched his own, at the lines around her eyes that were mostly laugh lines, at the face he had been looking at for 15 years and finding continuously new things in. "And everything is right," he said. "Everything is exactly right." She put her hand against his chest, flat against the worn flannel of his work shirt, and he put his hand over hers, and they stood in the kitchen in the early morning light with the coffee coming on and the children waking upstairs and the ranch outside beginning another day. Franklin Talbot had asked Raymond to keep his daughter safe. He had done that and more than that, in the only way that it was possible to fully keep someone safe, not by standing between them and the world, but by being the person who stood beside them in it, who knew the territory and knew the law and knew which fence posts were broken from which side, and who came back through the blizzard and the prairie summer and every ordinary Tuesday and was present, completely and without reservation, for all of it. He had promised a dying man, and the promise had been the beginning of something that the dying man had perhaps already seen the shape of, which Raymond thought was entirely in keeping with who Franklin Talbot had been. And he had fallen apart, consistently and completely, every time Inez Talbot had smiled at him, from the autumn of 1878 right up to this morning in 1896, and he fully intended to continue doing so for as long as he had the good fortune of being in the room when it happened. Which, given everything they had built, given the land and the children and the years and the kitchen table and the creek still running through the north pasture where it had always run, was likely to be a very long time. Upstairs, Franklin and Alina and Clarence began the particular morning negotiation of 3 children who share a household and have strong views about the distribution of its resources. Their voices came down through the ceiling, Franklin's measured, Alina's pointed, Clarence's cheerful and entirely unbothered by whatever the disagreement was. Raymond looked at Inez. Inez looked at Raymond. She smiled. He fell apart. It was, as it had always been, completely indistinguishable from joy.